and welcome to today's lesson, where we will answer the essential question, what happened as America looked to expand into the West? And specifically, we're going to focus on the events that led to the Louisiana Purchase, one of the major events in the early history of our country. And the first thing we're going to talk about is more or less what happened in the early years after the Constitution was passed and went into effect. How did the country evolve under the new system of government? And what challenges did they face? First thing the average American knows since elementary school is that George Washington was in fact elected president. He was elected president twice. 1789 was the only time in the history of our country that we had a presidential election in an odd year. And then he was re-elected in 1792, which was the first regularly scheduled U.S. presidential election that occurred in the first Tuesday in November. He is the only president we have ever had who ran unopposed. No one formally ran against him. He was that well regarded and that well respected. John Adams had the unfortunate task of becoming the second president. It's kind of like no one knows who replaced Michael Jordan. No one knows who replaced George Washington, except history teachers, and now you, because John Adams was that guy. One of the things John Adams was known for earlier in his life is he was actually a lawyer who defended the British soldiers who opened fire during the Boston Massacre. An older version of John Adams got to become the second president of the United States. Both George Washington and John Adams were considered Federalists, and I will explain what that means in just a moment. Actually, I just explained it right there. They believed in a strong central government. During the debate over the Constitution, Federalists favored the Constitution and Anti-Federalists opposed the Constitution. After the Constitution was passed, Federalists favored a strong government and Anti-Federalists favored a very limited government. And this is a very nice breakdown of what the dynamics were between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists after the Constitution was passed. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were essentially our first political parties in the United States. The Federalists were led by individuals such as George Washington, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is the guy on your $10 bill, and he was never President of the United States. And yes, there is a story there. Federalists believed generally that the federal government could do whatever it wanted to so long as the Constitution didn't specifically say they couldn't do it. So, unless the Constitution said, nope, you can't do that, the Federalists were like, well, I guess we can do it. They wanted the government to be strong and powerful. They wanted the central government to exert a lot more powerful influence than the state governments. Whereas the Anti-Federalists, and there should be a sign there that says Anti-Federalists on the other side of a T-chart, were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were considered the intellectual heavyweights of the early republic. There they are. They're the Anti-Federalists. They believed the federal government could not do anything that the Constitution did not specifically say they could do. So from their perspective, if the Constitution didn't say they could do it, it was their belief that they could not do it. So the analogy I like to draw is your student handbook. If you're the type of person who tends to think, oh, I can do anything that the student handbook doesn't specifically say I can't do, you would be more of a Federalist. Whereas if your attitude is, if the student handbook doesn't say I can do it, that means I probably shouldn't. You would be a little bit more of an anti-federalist. Anti-federalists believed in a limited federal government with respect for the rights of the states. So these were similar to the people who didn't want the Constitution passed in the first place, but at this point, since the Constitution was passed, they're like, okay, this new government needs to really hold itself back because the states should still be the most important part of our system of government. Looks like a good compare and contrast essay right there. The Anti-Federalists later became the Democratic Republicans, which, based on our modern history, is the most confusing title for a political party ever devised. The Democratic Republicans now are simply known as the Democrats. But there is a history there, and if you would like to know it, you will need to take a college course that I could teach. So our very first competitive election occurred in the year 1800. Now, this was an election where going into it, you did not know who was going to win. And that made it very interesting and very exciting. 1800, nice even-numbered year. Seems like we have interesting elections in even-numbered years with zeros at the end. And I will leave it at that. This was our first truly competitive presidential election, which, like I said before, made it exciting. John Adams was running for a second term, and at this point, the Federalists had been running the government for the first 11 or so years of the Constitution. At this point, John Adams was deeply unpopular. He had passed a couple of laws called the Alien Act and the Sedition Act, which were considered by many to be unconstitutional, and they really stripped people of some rights that they felt they should have. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, but was not involved in writing the Constitution because he was away as ambassador to France at the time, was the Democratic Republican candidate running against John Adams, and in the Electoral College, Thomas Jefferson won the election. So this is the first time in the history of our country where we decided to take power from one person or one party and give it to another person or another party, and that was significant because that was the whole idea behind founding a democratic republic. We didn't have to fight a revolution. We didn't have to fight a war. No one got beheaded. It was simply a peaceful transition from one party to another. And that is what made this such a remarkable and such a successful act of American democracy. And it is looked at as the first genuine test of true American democracy. So President Jefferson is in power, and he immediately has an interesting challenge called the Louisiana Purchase. And we're going to save that for our next lesson. At this point, it would probably be a smart idea for you to summarize in your Cornell notes everything about the Washington presidency, the Adams presidency, and the election of 1800. And in our next lesson, we will discuss what was the Louisiana Purchase.